Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 24 of All About Nothing. I am not going to apologize again for my irregularity. I'm going to proceed and go forward as best I can, which is kind of what today's topic is about. And so I'll start by saying yesterday I was having pretty rough day, and I had a little break, and I happened to be listening to my Pandora station. And as sometimes happens to me, Pandora sometimes reads my mind or sends me a signal. And I happened to hear the song by Bruce Hornsby, which is an old favorite of mine. I've actually posted it once before. It's called This Too Shall Pass. And one of the lines in the song that I love so much goes like this. He says, I might not have a full palette now, but I'll work with the colors I've got. And I love the song and I love the concept, and it's one of those hard won concepts for me. And for someone who loves color as much as I do, I've always, as many of us, kind of slipped into black and white thinking. In fact, my therapist, my beloved therapist, who I had for 4 decades, she used to sing this little song to me. I didn't think it was very funny at all, but she would sing this little song that went, It's always all or nothing. And that really was how my mind worked. It was either black or white or all or nothing. And I learned much later when I was starting to study trauma and Bessel van der Kolk was talking about the Rorschach test. And he said when the researchers showed the veterans the ink blot tests, either they saw miserable violence of the Vietnam War or nothing at all. And same with the sexual abuse survivors. Either they saw a bloody mess of sexual violence or it was just a splot of ink. There was nothing in between. And so I started thinking about that today as I was struggling with how much I have to do and how sometimes what stops me is if I can't do it perfectly or I can't do it all, it seems like it's not worth doing anything. And I thought, well, ugh, I don't want to have another apology note to you about no video yet or I can't keep up. So I thought, well, I'll just work with the colors I've got. And one of the things I wanted to mention today is, I've been reading Ruth Lanius's new book. It's called Sensory Pathways to Trauma Healing. And I'm a long-time follower of Ruth Lanius. I'm honored to share her name with her. And I remember back in 2003, I was at a conference, and many people have heard me tell this story before because it made such an impression. I was in a room. There were several hundred of us trauma therapists, and I'd never heard of Ruth Lanius before. She was really young then, certainly compared to me, and certainly compared to how old I am now. So I had never seen her before. And she presented some research, including her neuroscience research and brain scans, which at that time were relatively new. And so I hadn't seen anything like this before. And she talked about a very severe pileup accident where there were many, many cars that sort of skidded and ran into each other. And so many people were trapped in their cars, and many of the cars burst into flames. And it was a terrible trauma scene for so many people. And one of the things that she was talking about in this story, which I had heard people talk about before, but not in this way. she talked about how one of the victims of the traumatic car accident was trapped in her car, and so she was in what's referred to as an inescapable shock situation. And I've certainly heard inescapable shock situation before. I'd heard that expression and I knew what it meant. I'd thought of it more in terms of those dogs in those terrible experiments where they were being tortured with electric shock and they couldn't get away. And but Ruth was telling a story about this woman who was trapped in her car, couldn't get out, and her husband, he broke out the window of his side of the car, ran around the other side of the car, pulled her out, and got her out just in time before the car burst into flames. And they got her to the emergency room and took both of their brain scan images at the same time. And so Ruth's brain scan of this woman who was completely frozen in terror in an inescapable shock situation. I remember when Ruth showed the video or showed the scan to the room full of, 200, 300 trauma therapists like me. And in unison, we all saw the scan at the same time, and the whole crowd just went, it was like we'd never seen anything like this. The entire brain, with a tiny little flicker of light in the brainstem area, was completely dark. It looked like she was dead. And that is what happens to us when we are in this inescapable shock situation. And it's so severe, fight and flight are not possible. So there's this complete autonomic shutdown. It's kind of like when the animal is cornered, the prey animal is cornered by the predator, and there's no escaping. It has two options. Either it can feign death, which is like playing possum, where all the essential functions, in fact, almost all the functions of the brain and body, ratchet down to almost nothing. So the animal appears dead to the predator, because most predators, with the exception of vultures and a few odd predators that eat dead prey, most predators lose interest in the dead prey and they just wander off, and then the prey animal, kind of reconstitutes itself and runs off into the woods to recover. But the other option, that one's called playing possum or death feigning. The other one, and you may know about this from polyvagal theory, the other one is where all the functions of the system ratchet down to the point where they can't feel the pain of being eaten. And so that's the other version of the freeze response, either death feigning or numbing out to the point where there is no sensation in the organism, which is what we think of as traumatic numbing. And I remember when I first came into the trauma field, we were aware of the swings between hyperarousal and numbing, where you were either running from a tiger or you were kind of like not there at all, dissociated. And those are the black and whites, the two extremes of the trauma brain, the trauma awareness. Well, one of the things that became apparent, or one of the things that Ruth explained better or connected a few more dots for me, which are really helpful, particularly during this rough time that I've been going through. And that is that the impact of neglect, which is an inescapable shock situation, the impact of the neglect, one of them is this ratcheting down of the brain, this numbing effect, this dissociative brain, which is what results in what we now so fondly refer to as, not so fondly, refer to as the three P's of the neglect, which are the underfiring brain, the underfiring brain. And one of the things that Ruth and her team explain so beautifully in this new book, which I highly recommend to you, is that some of the impacts of this inescapable shock situation, which is the ratcheting down of the brain firing, is not only the numbing and the loss of emotion, because it really is a deadening of emotional tone, but also this blankness, this what Ruth refers to as tonic immobility, where everything just sort of goes into an immobilized state. We get attentional problems, which are often either slapped with an ADD or an ADHD diagnosis, rightly or wrongly, but certainly a difficulty with concentrating, a flatness of emotional affect. But one of the things that she added that I think is so useful to us, and certainly really gave me a boost last night when I read it in the book again, is that one of the sequelae, one of the impacts, the consequences of this emotional numbing, this brain deadening, is helplessness and hopelessness. One loses one's sense of agency and the impetus to start, continue, follow through, complete tasks, agency, which is, of course, intimately related to the three P's, but also hope. It's impossible to imagine something better, something good. It's like the whole world goes dark, like that dark brain that Ruth showed way back in 2003. And you know, I have to say this, way back in 2003, which is now almost 25 years ago, that's a long time. It's a long time for me to be reminiscing to. And when I was sitting in that room, and all of us therapists just sort of caught our breath with shock and disbelief, little did I know then, when I was sitting in that room, that I would be sitting here today talking to you, talking to you about my friend and associate, Ruth Lanius, who really is on a level with me where she thinks of me as her friend and colleague the way I never dreamed I would be a friend or colleague to someone of her caliber. So we never know what will happen. And this black and white thinking that my mother and my therapist talked with me about, that I was so stuck in, it can change. It can change. The one last thing I will say about this is, and you know, one of my favorite topics, endlessly interesting to me, is about regulation. And I often talk about the two different meanings for regulation. We've got affect regulation, which has to do with, you know, regulating the nervous system and the very things we've been talking about today. But there's also relationship uh, um, relationship regulation, excuse me. And the relationship regulation has to do with rupture and repair. And this is very dear to my heart because I came from a world without repair. So if a relationship was ruptured, which I famously ruptured relationship all the time, well after the natural stage of infancy, where it's inevitable that the infant's going to wet or cry or wake up the mother, or the mother's going to be tired, or the parents are going to be not getting along, or somebody's gone, or they're sick or poor, or living in a war zone or whatever, and there will be ruptures. But I suffered from inability to sustain, connection for many, many, many years. One thing I've learned in this long life of repairing my my battered brain and nervous system is that perfectionism is a symptom of dysregulation. Because if there's no hope of repair, I better be perfect. I better not make a mistake, because if I do, there's no getting back together. There's no living it down if I make a mistake. So perfectionism is a symptom, is an impact of dysregulation. So I leave you with that. This video, short and imperfect, and I'm working with the colors I've got and doing the best I can. And you know what? That has to be okay. And we'll get back together. And if I make a mistake and you tell me about it, I'll do my best to do better next time, and we will reconnect. So I thank you for listening, and I thank you for joining us. I want to make a pitch for the Oxford Trauma Conference, which is coming up, and I'm busily getting ready for it, and I'm so excited. I'm going to present a whole bunch of new to me material that I've been kind of putting together off and on over the last since 2017, and I'm very excited. It's the first time I've really presented it out in the world. So if you can't come to Oxford, I'd love it if you could. I'd love to meet you in person. If you can't come to Oxford, maybe you can join us online. And in any case, thanks for coming today, and I'll see you next time. Have a gentle day, be kind, and don't worry about getting it perfectly. We paint with the colors we've got. Bye for now.